my younger sister was 3 or so, she suddenly had an imaginary friend. I was a teenager at the time, so I was honestly quite glad she had something to distract her other than me, given that I was her 24/7 babysitter and, like all pubescent children, preferred to watch TV than to constantly entertain the child. So naturally, I always encouraged her to play with said friend, and she did so all day long, giggling in the living room while I calmly watched. My parents were also a little shocked at how much my sister was suddenly into her friend, but my mom was just chatting with her friend about how funny it was. Neither she nor I have ever had imaginary friends, so we both thought it was just fun. My father, however, was more silent on the subject, but I thought nothing of it at the time. Anyway, about a month or so later, we're all in the living room, and my sister is playing. My mom is on the phone with my grandma, and she suddenly calls, "What's your friend's name, baby?" And my child's sister answers Kevy. My dad immediately jumps up from his seat with a very strange look on his face. He goes to my sister and asks her to say their name again. And my dad just looks sick after that. My dad is a guy who wears his heart on his sleeve and isn't afraid to show his emotions, but I've never seen such a look of horror on his face before. Even now, 10 years later, I've never seen him so scared before. My dad runs into the apartment and I follow him out of curiosity, but he just calls my mom and they kick me out of the room. Eventually, later that day or the next, Dad tells me a story. You see, when he was little, he had an imaginary friend named Kevy, and considering he was the youngest child in the family by over 10 years, Kevy was his best friend. He had this imaginary friend for over 5 years, and my dad told me that at first Kevy was normal, but as time went on he got more and more angry and eventually started saying horrible things to my father, and that he had to do horrible things. It scared the hell out of my dad, and one day he told Kevy to go away, and he just did. My dad never told his family about Kevy's bad things, and they all assumed he grew out of it naturally, and never mentioned he had an imaginary friend to anyone, including my mother and me. He also didn't tell me exactly what Kevy told him, and I didn't press because he looked really scared. Anyway, for the next week, my family cleaned the house several times, went to church, and left cleaning pills all over the entryways of the apartment. We said that my sister Kevy was no longer allowed to stay, and although she was upset at first, she eventually stopped mentioning him and we never spoke of it again. 10 years have passed since then, and only recently did the memory come back to me after I reconnected with my father, and we reminisced about the time we spent in that apartment. However, I did not mention this event to him. My family is very superstitious people, so we've given it up completely, except for a constant lift every couple of months. It's always been a long-buried memory, and honestly, even sharing it out loud like this feels wrong. My name is Luke. I'm from the UK and I work as a district nurse. This is a nurse who visits patients in their own homes, nursing homes, etc., but not in a hospital. I've done time in hospitals, I guess you could say, but no more thanks. I wanted to tell this for a long time. It's short, but I also knew I wanted to describe it properly and in detail, so I waited for some free time to sit down and lay it out. A little about me before I start. I've been working as a nurse for almost 20 years. I have seen and dealt with most things you can think of. You can say that I've always been interested in the mysterious side of life. However, it was only after feeding that I began to believe in ghosts. Now I ask what ghosts are. I use paranormal podcasts, supposedly true stories and true crimes, and I'm sure you hear all the time that it's a true story. I'm sharing this to create a discussion, to make sure that professionals can encounter paranormal situations, and to get it on the record before some parts of my aging brain are lost to time. I would like to hear feedback, your thoughts about what the student and I saw. So on a cloudy British July day about 2 years ago, I was tutoring a third-year nursing student. The nursing student was close to qualifying and was what we call a mature student. They have children and return to university later. I will call her MM. Was naturally good with people. She was honest and caring. She and I went to see a patient, let's call her P, who had complex needs. She required observation, vital signs, examination, blood draws, and wound dressings. She lived in an old semi-detached house on the outskirts of the town, and because of the complexity of the visit, I had to collect items from the trunk of the car. I advised M to come in, introduce himself, and begin his assessment of P. We give third-year students more autonomy. After I collected all the items like BP monitor, HR monitor, SBO2 monitor, blood bottles, etc. The layout of the house when entering through the front door is as follows. Opposite was a thin corridor that led to an interior door. To the left was a staircase leading to the first floor, second if you are American. To the right was an open door that led into the sitting room, where there was a bay window to the front of the property. I entered, said hello. My eyes naturally went to the open living room where I saw an old woman. I will describe her later. I heard my student calling me from the door at the end of the hall. I walked down the hall and opened the door to see M talking to P in her kitchen. No worries. We looked after PM, doing most of the work with little input. The entire visit took maybe 30 minutes. And when things came to a close, I asked P who the lady was in her room. Did she say something like, "Lady? Which lady?" "The TV is on." I said, "No, the lady is in your room." P said again, "I am alone in my house." I looked at M, I think, trying to think. However, when I did, I noticed that she was pale and her eyes were wide. She looked scared. I advised them both to hold for 2 minutes. I'm now thinking that the confused lady entered the patient's house or something. However, when he reached the living room, no one was there and the TV was not on. Besides, it was a little 20-inch thing. I checked upstairs, but nothing. As indicated in the layout, the front door is across the hall from where I was, so I could see or hear someone leave. I told P that there was no one there. I needed to rest or something. P laughed and thanked M and herself, but before I got to what M and I were discussing, I saw this. I saw an older woman about 5'3" tall, with short white permed hair. She was wearing a brown pleated skirt, small dark-colored flat shoes, and a light-colored blouse that appeared to be white. She had her back to me and was walking away. She was only about 4 feet away from me. She was hard, like someone was looking at M or anyone else I interact with. I didn't see any part of her face, and in a way, I guess I'm glad about that. Anyway, when M and I got outside the grounds of the estate, I asked M to describe exactly what she saw, for my sanity, and to make sure I wasn't missing any preconceived notions. She perfectly described the appearance of the lady, the same as I had seen. The only difference was that she said she was approaching the chair and moving like she was going to sit down. However, she could not see her face like I could. Obviously, this scared me a lot. I mean, I just saw a ghost with a witness. Did I see a ghost? Was I witnessing a time slip, or was this a conscious spirit living in a house she may have lived in at one point? I also have to say that even though she dressed in clothes for old women, they didn't look dated, if that makes sense. I mean, I see other old women wearing similar clothes like her. I don't know, but all of this really touched me, and that's why I'm here, so what do you think? So many years ago, I became a certified nursing assistant. It was a simple job. Basically, we take care of adults all day. Now I have my share of scary things. Wiping butts, picking up poop off the floor, but that came with the job. And honestly, after a while you get numb anyway, but that's not what I want to share. I wanted to talk about my experience when a patient is close to death. I mean, terrible things happen in the days before. So let's start with my first experience. I won't name names due to laws and regulations, but we'll start with Jay. Jay was now a retired Marine who had seen combat in Vietnam and was also a retired chef. Jay was a bad dude. He has a hole in his throat from years of smoking, so it was difficult for him to speak, although some things could be understood. Now, the first thing to change when death approaches is the smell that comes from one person's body. It's hard to explain, but it just smells like rotting meat. I know, terrible. But when I noticed the smell on Jay, I was sitting with Jay and talking about life in general. I try not to talk about death, but manage it that way. Finally, we got to the point, and Jay's whole attitude kind of turned around. He raised his hand for me to stop talking. He took a deep breath and uttered a few words. There were men in my room last night. My heart sank, tall and dark, in a top hat. I could clearly see the fear in Jay's eyes. Struggling and being a sheriff in the 80s couldn't have prepared him for what he saw that night. I had a blank look. I didn't know what to say to him, but he was clearly stressed. He shrugged my shoulders and continued watching his show. Maybe an hour or so passed. Jay was in the living room and I was in the kitchen. The TV volume turned up a little because of Jay's hearing. We both jumped when we heard a loud crash in his room opposite, but it was no ordinary sound. It sounded like someone had dropped a piece of steak on the floor. It was such a distinctive sound. Even if Jay heard it, he heard it too. He looked at me with raised eyebrows. I assumed it was someone in the house. I looked at Jay and told him to stay put. I had to check on the house. Now I slowly turned the corner into the hall. I slowly looked at his door and saw a shadow from under the door and finally yelled, "Get out of this house now, or I'll call the police." I quickly opened the door, but there was nothing there. Everything was intact and in its place. The windows and curtains were left as they are. I searched the entire room, but no one was there. I went back to Jay and explained what had happened. He looked at me and said, "Dark man." I froze, afraid to turn around, but quickly turned around, seeing nothing behind me, and Jay standing on the corner of the corridor. He could see things I couldn't. Now, because Jay was the guy I was, I turned off the air and went back to his show. I'm freaking out right now. I started searching the whole house, every door and nook, under the beds, in the closets. Nothing. Everything was empty. When my 12-hour shift was about to end, a second nurse finally arrived. I let them in and explained what was going on, but they were also scared because they were on the night shift. But in the end, I left with a lot of questions and a lot of fear. Fast forward to the next day, and I got a call saying that Jay had passed away during the night, but they found him on the floor next to the bed. The head nurse heard a loud bang in the middle of the night and rushed into the room to find Jay on the floor, not breathing, with no pulse. Since he had DPR, there was nothing we could do. A few days later, it was determined that he had a heart attack, and he tried to leave his bed. He rolled to the edge of the bed, and his body rolled off the side, hitting the floor with a sound like meat hitting a hard floor. Jay and I heard the same sound the day before. So on to experience number 2. I once looked after this man. FF was an elderly gentleman who lived in a 110-year-old Victorian house. He was a mechanic all his life and was very intelligent. He was diagnosed with dementia and Alzheimer's, a mix that would cause a lot of confusion and combat incidents. Other than that, though, it really was as sharp as it gets. Now, on this one night, F seemed to be on edge. I asked what was going on. He explained that he had been hearing something lately, that he was having trouble sleeping. I kind of shrugged my shoulders and helped him to bed. I went to my room and got into bed ready to sleep. A few minutes passed and I heard a scream from F's room. I jumped up and ran over. F was lying in the corner of his bed in the fetal position, terrified. I turned on the light and asked what was going on. F explained that there was a demon sitting on his desk in the corner watching him. He explained that his skin was black, like it was burnt and charred, and his eyes were sunken with black voids. He said it made him smile. Now, as medical professionals, it is very important that we maintain a professional stance. But that night, I must confess, shook me to the core. I talked to him about God and prayed with him. All the while, as F looks back at me over and over again across the table, there is a look of desperation on his face. We end the conversation and I head for the door. But then, F, the bravest man I have ever known, asked the strangest question for a reasonable reason. He said, "Will you sleep with me on my bed?" I kind of laughed and asked, why would I? He cut me off, and with pure fear in his eyes, he says, because it never went away. He is still there. While you were praying, it mimicked what you were saying in some low demonic tone. Now I am completely terrified. Honestly, nothing could have prepared me for such an answer. I tried my best to keep a straight face. Remember to be professional. I answered, of course, but I will sleep on the chair in the corner. Needless to say, I was up all night. A few weeks passed and the morning came. I helped F to get out of bed. He quickly turned and braced himself on the old oak staircase that led to the door. He was suddenly very distracted. He didn't talk the whole time, and when we went down the stairs, he also sat upstairs the whole time. They sat down to breakfast anyway. He put his fork down on his plate and sat back down, looked into my eyes. He pointed to the kitchen door. "Are these your nieces or something?" I was surprised. What? I asked, confused. Those kids over there, are they with you? Now I began to feel a cold wind on my back and shivers from head to toe. F, there are no children there. But then a child's laughter was heard from the stairs. I jump up. F turns to the corner of the room and asks the wall, "How long have you been dead?" I yelled, "F, what are you talking about?" Children, their clothes are old and their faces are somewhat sunken. They look as if they have been rotting for a long time. By this time, I jumped in and explained that I needed a moment. I left the kitchen more scared than ever. Eventually, I pulled myself together and went back. F was there not worried eating his eggs, and I just sat there not knowing what to do. Most of my experience was somewhat scary, even terrifying, but definitely the main thing in the books is death itself. There are so many unknowns with this. Many people fear death because the afterlife is an inexplicable thing. We only have testimonials from people who have completed a certain number of minutes. I have been lucky enough to never face death, but I have witnessed it with my own eyes several times. And here is one of those stories about the last hours of F. So it's been months since the whole kitchen incident. Nothing terrible happened, except for the noise in the house or footsteps on the oak stairs. Most of the house had original wooden floors. Remember, this house was about 110 years old, so the anomalies weren't too alarming. I can only imagine how many things happened in that old house. Nevertheless, in those months, F's health steadily deteriorated. It got to the point where he was no longer talking or eating. Hospice is also involved now. For those who don't know, this is an organization that helps people close to death. The goal of hospice is to provide comfort, so F was given regular doses of morphine most of the time to make his wait for death more comfortable. I went into room F to do some routine vitals. I held his wrist with my index and middle fingers, looking for a pulse. Strange, I said to myself. His pulse was barely there. The paramedics call this a thready pulse, and it was very slow. I started counting his breath. In my head, I see his chest rise and fall. One, I would tell myself I don't remember the exact count, but I remember panicking. It was too little for oxygen consumption. Like most seniors, the DNR is in effect, so there really wasn't much I could do. I knew it would pass in a few hours. To make it easy for him to pass, I put a chair. I started reading him a book. The latter, apparently, is deteriorating hearing. Even in a coma, people can sometimes hear what's going on around them. I was about halfway through the book. FYI, F is comatose and in a fluid state due to morphine to which he no longer responds or moves. But now I was facing the biggest fear of my life, because F's eyes widened and began to scan the room quickly. He reached out and grabbed my hand. My heart hit my throat. His breathing quickened. It was quick and shallow. I started trying to pull away. I grabbed F's hand. His eyes were fixed on me. I looked him straight in the eye, and he had a 1,000-yard stare. Empty. No expression. He didn't say anything, but I was petrified. I didn't move, just looked into F's eyes. His breathing slowed. Tears began to fall from his eyes. I gathered courage. I said, "It's okay, F, it's time to go. Don't be afraid, I'm here with you. You are not alone." And with that, he took a deep breath, and I saw his life drain from his eyes. It's hard to explain what happens or how you can literally see life leave someone's eyes. His grip, however, weakened my arm. His hand became icy. The hand fell to the side. It was not scary to watch his last breath. More like relief, I guess. It was as if everything was finally over. I watched the fearful eyes turn into empty, dilated pupils. His head fell back on the pillow, his eyes still on mine. Even after passing, his eyes remained open. I reached for his wrist. It was still warm, but also cold. I look for a pulse, and there is nothing. I reach for his neck. There is no pulse. I watch his chest, neither rising nor falling. I make a clock, 16:28, time of death. I make a note and call the hospice. They send an RN right away. They confirm death. We call F's friend and only known confidant. She's in another state in a few hours. However, she asked us to lock and unplug the appliances. But this whole ordeal, man, was traumatic. Anyway, the coroner is coming in a few hours. They rolled the gurney, unzipped the bag with the corpses. They only smelled like death and cheap detergent. It's a smell I'll never forget. They went into F's room and wrapped him in sheets. They lifted him on a gurney, wiped the hospital bed. They forced us, an RN, to fill out a questionnaire, gave us a card, and just like that, They took F's body. F was single, had no children, and knew no family. As far as we could tell, that was the end of the family line. RN said goodbye and left. I was left alone in this gigantic, empty, silent house. I started locking the doors and windows, turn off the lights and turn off electrical appliances. I walk into FS room and the coroner's smell is still there. I sit on the chair, still climbing up to his bed, and sat there for several hours. I was just thinking about everything that happened. It was difficult. To be honest, I was depressed for a while after that, questioning everything I knew about life. Watching someone's life slip away like that, staring them right in the face, is a little disconcerting. Anyway, I'm over it all now, but the scars, they're definitely still with me. When I was a senior in college several years ago, I lived in an old house about a 5-minute walk from my campus with 5 of my girlfriends. It was still the time of COVID, so we spent a lot of time just at home because we couldn't go anywhere. At the beginning of this, I will also say that this house was old and many of the windows did not close. Our landlord sucks, as do many colleges, and did nothing to fix the problem. But with 6 of us and often 1 or 2 guys sleeping in the house, it was mostly safe, and many of us kept the windows open anyway. Our college was located in a small town near the second most dangerous city in the state, but the area around the campus was relatively safe. In any case, when it started to get warm in the early spring, we sat on the roof to sunbathe, and this roof overlooked our street. We used to go out onto the roof from our roommates, let's call her Mary, her bedroom window on the 2nd floor because it looked right onto the roof. Our street was residential and didn't have a lot of traffic, but we did have a few young guys call out to us as they drove by, but nothing seemed sinister since we were college students. However, one evening at the end of term, Mary went up to her room to call her brother while we were all hanging downstairs. Then she rushed down and said she saw the ladder leading up to the roof where we were all going to sunbathe, and right by her open window. We later learned that she said out loud to her brother what she saw before going down. When she told us this, my other roommate and her boyfriend ran outside and found a man running out of our house with a ladder, and we believe he heard Mary tell her brother that she saw the ladder and knew that he was caught. It was so dark they could not understand anything about him. I immediately texted our landlord and asked if he had anyone who could come to the house to do any work, and he said no. Then we called the police, who arrived. They investigated and patrolled our house for a couple of nights, but we never found out who the man was, what his intentions were, or even if he had been there before. It happened when I was 14 years old. I'm 29 years old at the moment to share this, but I remember this story from time to time, meaning once or twice every few years. For some reason, it also puts me in a weird mood. Anyway, the other day I was walking around town with one of my friends. I tried to hold her hand, but then she thought I just bumped into her and apologized, so I was able to recover easily. Then I saw a group of kids skateboarding past us, and lo and behold, that's what triggered this memory. So I decided I'd write it down. I'm not going to use this kid's real name, so I'll just call him Vinny. I come from a town where the people you went to school with in kindergarten were the same kids you graduated with. Vinny moved to our school about halfway through the year. When new children came to our school, everyone always gravitated towards them. At 14, I was kind of a goofball, but also kind of a goofball, which somehow made me strangely likable to most people. Vinny always sat alone at lunch. What I found interesting about him was that he would get furious when people asked him if he skated. I took it as a challenge to try to get to him, and it worked. The first time he and I were together, I remember the teacher asking him if he had any textbooks. He replied, "My wife never confirmed my school schedule with the front office." I remember everyone thought it was funny. Are you 14 years old and have a wife? Obviously, he was trying to kill the teacher. After school, my friends and I were skating, and at some point we saw Winnie. I remember talking to my friends about what he said, and we all had a weird crush on the kid. It took a while, though after about a week of us letting him hang out with us, he became one of the boys. One of my buddies asked if we could go sleep over at his house on Friday night, under the guise of taking turns staying at each other's houses to skate, play video games, and smoke green stuff. He looked alarmed, and I wished it mattered at the time, But the next day at school, he asked his parents and said he was fine. My friends and I rode our bikes to where he lived with our night clothes and skateboards strapped to our bags. We met his family, which at first glance seemed quite normal. But then things got a little weird. I mean, first of all, his father had a huge collection of weapons. At the time, I thought it was pretty weird, to be honest. He even took us out to the field by the canal to shoot from machine guns. I know, it wasn't cool of him with our parents' consent. Next, we met Winnie's wife. Yes, the girl was real. She was also 26. And while we lived in the southern U.S., yes, I know, even that was taboo. They would like to hold hands and stuff like that. And at the time, we honestly thought that was pretty cool. It was like dating a senior when you were a freshman. Only he was in high school and she was paying taxes. However, it took things to a whole new level of awesomeness when Winnie's dad hugged Winnie's mom and the other a little girl who couldn't have been much older than us at the time. Apparently, it was also his wife. We then spent about 2 hours praying with the family in the living room. I was raised Catholic, but I couldn't tell what religion they practiced. Once we were done with that, we went outside to start skateboarding. After a few minutes, his father came outside and ordered us to enter the house. Winnie's mother then made us stand in line outside the bathroom to take a bath. It bothers me too, but I do remember that we weren't allowed to drain the water from the bathtub. I was the last one to bathe. In addition, all the mirrors in the house were covered with sheets. I have no idea what that means. For me, it makes more sense to not have mirrors at this point. But we were ordered to go to bed, even though the sun hadn't set yet. Vinny went to bed with his wife. The three of us that were left just laid on the one big bed and talked about how we weren't having fun. But the last straw was Winnie's parents, and possibly another woman making a mess in the next room. It was almost 11 p.m. when we decided to just get on our bikes and leave. It was dark, and we had to drive through some pretty bad areas, but we made it to my friend's house safely. Winnie's mother also later called our parents and left rather cryptic messages that meant trouble. Vinny was picked up from school about a week later, and we never saw him again. Now I don't know what this family did. Maybe it wasn't as bad as I thought when I was a kid and I just didn't understand something. All I know is that we felt incredibly uncomfortable, so uncomfortable that we decided to leave. I don't have a problem with religion, but if it was part of their practice, I think it's a little weird. Out of curiosity, I went looking for Vinny on Facebook. All I can confirm is that he, his mother, father, and one of his sisters died. There was no public record of what happened to them or if they died at the same time or anything. It was a truly amazing experience that I will never forget. It's something I come back to a lot too, and I think it's worth telling. I wish I had a little more information about the family and what happened to them, but I guess I'll never know. This was not the case recently. I believe it was when I was between 9 and 11 years old. I am 17 now. So me and my best friend Katie were in the park of our elementary school. We used to hang out at this park a lot because we both lived right next to it, so it was very convenient. Our city is dangerous because it is known for high levels of robbery, sexual assault, and even human trafficking due to the large highway that runs through our city. She and I rode our bikes that day to our favorite picnic table, and that table is located where we have a good view of the church across the street. Keep this in mind as well as all street intersections. It is a place that we can all see without obstruction. So we're sitting at the top of the table just talking about whatever the kid is talking about when all of a sudden I have a weird feeling and I look up. We stand facing the church opposite. We are not far from this street, but far enough that I doubt what I saw. This grown man is fighting this very young child outside his car. The back door of his car is open. I'm not sure if the child was walking alone because I didn't look at the time. I don't know where the car stopped either. Anyway, Kathy and I watched in horror, and we were silent and fixated on what was going on when suddenly he picks up the baby and throws him into the back of the car. He runs around the driver's side and accelerates. This happens for about 30 seconds, maybe up to a minute. The reason I'm not sure what I saw is because I didn't hear the baby make any noise, but we were far enough away that we may not have heard anything. The baby was also wearing a very large neon orange construction jacket, to the point where it might not have been a baby at all. That's how big the jacket was. If it wasn't for the child, then why would he throw this man in the car like that and then drive away? What I mean is that when he threw the jacket or the baby, he put a lot of effort into it, meaning it was harder than the jacket lift. After that, we just stood there in silence. Eventually, we thought, what the hell is this? We got on the bike and rushed to her house, and I think about it regularly. She and I are still best friends. We haven't mentioned it in a long time. I'm not really sure if she remembers it, but it always haunts me. Have I witnessed a child being kidnapped, a parent abusing their child, or something that looked very sinister but wasn't? It's a confusing event, and I've explained it as best I can, but I don't know, something tells me it was a child abduction. So, for context, my family was on vacation in Spain at a resort where you have something like a small bungalow with different rooms. At the time, I was about 8. My sister was 10, and my brother was about 16. The first thing that happened was when me, my mother, and my sister slept in the same bed as arranged by my parents, and since I was the youngest, I had to lie in a horizontal position facing the doorway. I woke up to see my sister getting out of bed, which in itself is not unusual. However, she was wearing a very specific jumpsuit that you would never pack for a holiday to Spain, but one that we definitely had at home. The last thing I remember, my sister and I were wearing a vest and pants to bed, so I look over to where she was before and see that she's fast asleep and not in onesie. The next morning I looked, and we didn't bring it. A day after that, my sister told me to stop walking at night because it scared her. I'd never done that before, so I asked her to explain. She said she saw me crawling on the bed, and when she called me, I said hush. Years later, I told my mom about it, and she said she also saw me crawling around my parents' bed, and that my dad started waking up at around 3:15 a.m. every night we were there with no suggestions. My parents also had the worst fights while we were there. I'm pretty skeptical, but I wonder if there was more to it than just illusions. Back in 2001, when I was a senior in high school, I had my first girlfriend that I was madly in love with. Her family took me in as an extra son, so I spent most of the next year there after school. My girlfriend and I got home from school before her parents got home from work, so we usually sat in the kitchen eating snacks and doing homework. One day my girlfriend comes down from her bedroom and usually takes the stairs, but quickly dashes down the hall to return to the kitchen where I'm sitting at the table. I ask her why she was behaving so strangely. She then tells me that when she reached the bottom of the stairs, she apparently saw an older man with a big long white beard standing in the office. I go, investigate, and there was nothing there. I then ask if she thought she saw a ghost, and she doesn't know what she saw, but what she described was exactly what it was. I teased her a bit that how could this house be haunted after all they were the second owners, and it wasn't even more than 10 years old. Previously, the neighborhood under construction was also just a forest. Some time passes anyway. At the moment, I don't remember how long, but this topic did not come up again. That was until I saw something in person, in a similar situation, but with roles reversed. I started to walk into the kitchen, when out of the corner of my eye, I saw a man in their dining room, which was to the right of the kitchen, sitting at the head of the table wearing what looked like a green velvet suit, or a suit that was not will be commonplace nowadays. I turned my head completely, and there was nothing. I would tell my girlfriend, but ruled out the fact that maybe her observation affected my perception or something. It should also be noted that I believe in the possibility that there may be more to this life than we can normally imagine. I am very skeptical. Fast forward to summer, and her friend from Brazil is coming here for winter break. My girlfriend and I are in our room as teenagers, and her friend, who was giving us space, bursts through the door in tears. She speaks quickly in Portuguese, describing how she was downstairs listening to her CD player when she ran into a man with a long white beard in his office. This also more or less convinced me. I mean, there was really no reason for my girlfriend to tell her friend because the subject never came up again, and she had no interest in the subject other than her own observations. A few weeks ago, my ex-girlfriend returned to the United States with her parents. We go out to dinner together and I bring up the subject. Her mother says bluntly, "Yes, I saw people all the time, usually on the first floor and in the basement. I just never said anything to be strong for our kids. Then her dad chimes in that he was sure they would be living in this house if it wasn't on the market while he was looking for a house next door. Something told him that they would live there. The house went on the market the next day, and they soon moved in, so we have 3 audience counts. I exclude myself. That a harmless apparition fitting a similar description was in this house. Until today, I want to send an email to the current family asking if they have seen the bearded man, but I don't know. By the way, this all happened in Connecticut, and I would love to go back there and see it again. This happened about 7 months ago. I was in San Diego for an interview and staying at my favorite hotel in Sorrento Mesa. For some background, I'm a 40-year-old guy and a pretty big guy at that. I'm 6'1" and a former strip club bouncer. So, on the 3rd night I was late after meeting up with old friends after the interview. I got back to the hotel around 2 a.m. with Sonny's Donuts. After a bit of eating, drinking, and watching South Park after COVID, I decided to smoke before bed. It happened around 3 o'clock in the morning. Eventually I go downstairs to the smoking area by the fountain, but there is another couple there who also live in the hotel. I didn't want to impose on him, so I decided to just walk around the outside of the hotel while I smoked. I walked around the pool, the barbecue area, the basketball courts, then went back to the side door. As I did, a black sedan pulled up next to me and stopped. The window rolled down, and a little Asian girl asked if I knew how to get out of the parking lot and back to the street. Now, from where we were when she asked me, it was literally about 150 feet in a straight line in front of her, so I honestly thought she was drunk or just blind. So I politely said yes, just go straight and turn left at the tree. She then asked me if I could get in the car and show her around. Then again, I'm a former strip club bouncer, and this woman looked a lot like Walmart Ali Wong. I mean, there was absolutely no intimidation factor, but somehow I immediately felt awkward. Again, it was literally right in front of her. She saw the road. Also, all the windows were tinted way more than they should have been, and I honestly couldn't tell if anyone else was in the car at the time. I used smoking as an excuse not to get in the car, but she said she didn't mind and gave me a creepy smile. I politely declined and pointed out again that the road is literally here, so I'm going back in about 5 seconds anyway. She asked again if I could come in and show her around. It was like a weird kid or an ice cream truck kind of situation. I mean, guys, how often do good-looking women just pull up and ask you to get into their car at 3 a.m. in a hotel parking lot, right? How often does anyone ask a big bearded guy to just get in the car under these conditions? Nothing was right about it. However, I politely declined again as I finished smoking, and luckily I was already standing at the door of the hotel when it all started, so I just walked in. A woman. She drove with the window down right to the exit she asked me to show, so I reported it to the front desk. They said they would follow up on it, but I'm pretty sure none of it ever got done or came out. But it's just one of those things that makes me wonder why the hell she really wanted me in the car so badly. I mean, a handsome man? I don't, so it must be some kind of scam. I just wonder how much danger I was really in. My mother worked long shifts at the airport 7 days a week. So me, a 12-year-old girl, and my little sister, a 10-year-old girl, were home alone most of the time. Also, FYI, we lived in a house with gates on the windows and a gate that had to be opened to get to the front door. It was late at night, around 10 p.m., and my sister and I were watching TV and getting ready for bed. About this time, I noticed some noises coming from our front door and realized it was someone banging on the gate. I was naive then and decided to open the door to see who it was. He was a young white man in his 20s. He was wearing a black and white striped shirt and a bag of jeans. I asked him what he needed, and he sat there with a blank face and calmly said he needed me to let him in. I asked him why, and he repeated and said, "Let me in. I'm having trouble." He kept looking over his shoulder, and I felt a little nervous and decided not to open the gate for him. As soon as I made the decision not to let him in, the police showed up and pulled their guns on this guy. They ordered him to walk backwards with his hands up, and at that point, I decided it was time to close the door. I quickly realized that he might be on the run from the police for a crime he had committed. To this day, I wonder if I had opened that door and let him in, what might have really happened. This is something I try not to dwell on too much. My parents divorced in 1997. I was born in 1990, so I was 7 years old. They remained friends, but my mother moved into my grandparents' old house. My grandparents had quite a bit of money and had recently moved without selling their house, so it was no problem for them to let my mother and I move into their old house. We also lived there for about 5 years. It was me, my mother, and my 2 sisters, who are a few years older than me, and our dog. What I'm about to tell you is not in chronological order, because I don't remember when it all happened. But I assure you that everything I'm telling you is 100% true. So the house had 3 floors, the ground floor, the basement, and the top floor where my sister and I slept. The basement was the most terrifying place in the house. The staircase led from the basement to the first floor, then to the second floor like a spiral, and most of the steps creaked and made a loud noise when stepped on. Several times a week you hear footsteps coming slowly from the basement up the stairs, pausing briefly on the first floor and then continuing on to the second floor. Most of the time the footsteps stopped outside my older sister's room, but they varied and sometimes stopped outside my room or my middle sister's room. But we've all heard it. My mom didn't like to talk about it, but my sisters and I often talked about it the next day and confirmed that we heard it outside of whatever room it stopped at. But we all hated going down to the basement. You'd think it was a huge basement that the kids would enjoy playing in, but we just hated it. Our dog never went down to the basement either. She seemed to hate it as much as we did. But down in that basement, all sorts of little things happened. Lights would randomly go off, things would move, and you could often hear something moving there even when no one was supposed to be there. One evening, my sisters and I played with our walkie-talkies, trying to get the local police channel, something kids did in the 90s. This time, however, the voice on the walkie-talkie was different and sounded much closer. The voice said all kinds of things. He spoke directly to my older sister and said it would hurt her. He even said her name, but I don't think he ever answered our questions. We got scared and turned off the radio. After a minute or so, our dog ran into our room and barked out of place. Our dog was big and very protective of us kids and kept barking in the room, which has never happened before or even since. Another time, my mom and I were home, but my sisters and the dog weren't there. I was playing in my room and my mom was doing what moms do, and all of a sudden I hear very loud footsteps coming from the basement, even though I was on the second floor in my room, walking, almost running, coming up from the basement, then continuing up the stairs to the second floor. I remember how my heart just stopped when I listened to the footsteps. My mom never walked so heavy and angry. The footsteps continued until they left my room, then stopped and the door suddenly slammed very hard. The door closed. I screamed and started to cry. Mom climbed the stairs and tried to open the door, but could not. It looked like the door was locked, although I don't think there was even a lock on the door. Mom yelled at me to calm down while she ran downstairs for tools to break down the door. While she was lying there, and I, 7, 8 years old, was crying, the door suddenly opened and opened. Another time, when my sisters and dog were away, there was a thunderstorm and I was deathly afraid of thunder for some reason. I've never been afraid of thunder before or since, but that night, for whatever reason I was, and in the basement, everything just went totally crazy. We heard things being thrown there, glass breaking, which we confirmed the morning after because we saw glass and stuff thrown and broken all over the place. Footsteps were heard running up and down the stairs, and my mother and I hugged each other, both frightened by what we were hearing. One day we were sitting in the living room just scared to death. The front door opened, then closed, opened and closed again for several minutes. We sat huddled together until the storm ended and everything seemed to stop. There were a lot of other little things going on, but these are the ones that came to mind and seemed to get worse when my dog wasn't around for whatever reason. And it was more after my older sister. And even if I told you about what happened to me, she has a lot more experience than I do. A couple of times she claimed to have even seen an old man watching her sleep, and it's really creepy to think about. I haven't talked to anyone about this experience except my mom and sisters, so it's good that I got my mind off it. If you have any questions about the house or the experience, just ask. We lived in the house from about 1997 to 2002 and only moved after that. So my parents went away for the weekend because it was their wedding anniversary. I was the only one in the house. I'm 19. I have a sister who is 17, but she stayed with a friend that night. So it was just me and the dog, and earlier in the day I washed my sheets and put them in the dryer. A few hours later, when I went back to see if they were dry, I found out they weren't, and it turns out the dryer actually broke, which was really annoying. I called my parents and told them what happened. I went to see if I could find any sheets to put on my bed until mine was dry, but there really weren't any other than my sister's that would fit my bed. I just decided I would sleep in my parents' bed, as it was quite comfortable there. Later that night, I'm in bed with my dog sleeping next to me, and I've left my parents' door ajar in case the dog wants to leave the room during the night. I'm just watching YouTube and waiting to feel tired enough to fall asleep when suddenly I get a very strange feeling. It felt like someone was watching me, and although it was a pretty creepy feeling, I was with my dog, so I wasn't totally scared or alone. I lit the lamp and tried to sleep because my phone was about to die. It's almost 3 a.m. I think it was around 2:55 a.m. when I woke up, and normally I don't wake up randomly, but I look over and see my dog sleeping at the bottom of the bed. I look at the door and see what looks like someone kneeling on the floor and sort of holding on by leaning against the wall. I searched for probably a minute to figure out what I was actually looking at, and it looked like a human, so I hid under the covers and stayed there for a few minutes. I finally worked up the courage to look, and when I did, everything that was there was gone. This may seem comforting to others, but to me it was much more disturbing. I'd like the shadow to stay there because that would mean I must have just seen something, like a shadow cast by something in the room or whatever. The fact that it is gone suggests that something or someone was actually there. After that, I didn't go to sleep properly. It was around 5 a.m. when I finally fell asleep, and now my sleep schedule is kind of messed up. I'm not quite sure what it was all about. I mean, there was nothing near the door that could make a shape that would fit someone who was kneeling and leaning against the wall like that. I don't think my house is haunted because this is the first time this has happened, and my parents' house is not very old. It was built in the 80s. That was a few days ago, and everyone is home now, thank the Lord. Nothing has happened since, but I would like to know if you have any suggestions on what I should do about it. I'm 29 years old. I live in an apartment in the sketchy side of my town, so I'm not used to strange people driving up and strange things happening. I've been through a home burglary, so I'm very vigilant when it comes to keeping myself and my home safe. I also smoke cigarettes. It's a bad habit, I know, but if there are cats and I don't want my house to smell like smoke, I'll go out on my balcony to smoke. That's exactly what I was doing when it happened. I was sitting on the balcony smoking and just enjoying my night when I noticed a car that I had never seen before pull into the back parking lot of my apartment right outside the balcony. I felt a little confused at first, but I didn't want to look like a paranoid neighbor, so I continued to sit and smoke a cigarette. Then I hear footsteps coming through my yard. A big and stout man, whom I have never seen before, walks briskly through my yard. Again, I still don't try to do a lot of that because they might be next door to my neighbor or something. My anxiety is definitely on high alert, but I don't mean panic mode, until I realize he's walking right into my part of the yard. He then does something that still drives me crazy as I share this. He stops right in my yard, looks at me from the balcony without saying a word. I'm in a panic right now. I say out loud, "Hell no." Jump up, slam and lock the balcony door, run to the upstairs bathroom and dial 911. I listened for every sound from downstairs as I stood in the bathroom panicking. To be honest, it sounded like someone was messing with my back door at this point. I don't know for sure because I was on high alert, but I know he was in my yard for a few minutes because I was in my bathroom for a few minutes until I decided to look out the balcony window. I saw him walk to his car and get in, which also tells me that I don't think he was there to rob me, but maybe something more sinister. Luckily, he was lazy because I live on the cheaper side of town, so you can imagine the quality of my doors and locks. I'm really hoping it was just some guy who was drunk or high and had the wrong house or whatever, but my gut tells me otherwise. Regardless, I just hope it doesn't happen again. My cousin and I are the same age, both female, and we are now 25 years old. She's only 5 days younger than me, and her family rented a floor in my parents' house when we were little, So we basically did everything together and spent every day together until we were 5, when her family I bought an apartment in another city, about 30 kilometers from the city in which I lived. Because we had a very strong bond, almost codependent, it was very difficult for us to get used to not living together. And after 2 years, we agreed with my parents that we would visit each other every weekend. And during the summer holidays, she would spend a week with us, and I will spend the second week with them, and we all basically exchanged like this for the rest of the summer vacation. This also went on for years. Since we spent all our free time together, by the time we were 10, 11, we had exhausted all of our backyard adventure ideas. Climbing trees, building a tree house, pitching tents, camping in the backyard, etc. We really needed something new, so we decided to go fishing together on the river near my house every Friday. It's a 20-minute walk. Now, of course, we didn't have the tools we needed for real fishing. We had a butterfly net that we put in the water, and on a good day, we would catch about a dozen small fish with it. This was enough for our restaurant game that we would like to play. We would come home, bake the fish in the sun, and then serve it, and then put it on plastic plates, which we would then treat to our imaginary customers. We've been doing this for weeks at this point, and always made sure we were safe doing it. I say we never got into the river, and it wasn't that difficult because it's a very peaceful area. We call it the Yellow Bridge, and usually when we were there was no one else near the river. But one day it was completely different. That's how I remember it too. So a couple of days ago, a memory the meeting suddenly popped into my head. We were either 10 or 11 years old. It was Friday, we had her that week. So we took a butterfly net and went fishing on the river. We were sitting alone under a large willow tree by the river, and suddenly, seemingly out of nowhere, a man appeared. He was standing a couple of meters away from us. He had blackish hair with a lot of gray, so I'm guessing he was in his 40s or 50s. He was wearing a dark blue t-shirt, slightly stained at the collar. He asked us what we were doing, and we said we were fishing. He continued to walk back and forth along that part of the shore. Now, under the Yellow Bridge, the length of the shore itself is at least 500 meters. He could have gone anywhere, but he stayed where we were. Then he came a little closer, and we stood up. He then told us that he must be having problems with his wife, and we just nodded our heads, trying to avoid conversation and obey the rule of not talking to strangers. We didn't ask him anything. He took out a clamshell from his pocket and unfolded it in front of us. "I must show you my wife," he said. "Okay," we answered. Having found what he was looking for, he came even closer and turned the phone towards us. It was a picture of a fully nude woman sitting in a chair with her legs apart. We just nodded. Then he showed us more pictures, and it was quite clear that it wasn't his wife, because there were different women in the pictures, but they were all inappropriate from head to toe. And now that I think about it, the image quality, fashion, and aesthetic can best be described as, well, the kind of 70s crap you'd probably find in a magazine, if you catch my flow. Maybe he took the pictures from an old magazine or someone sent them. I don't know, but I remember looking at my cousin and saying that it wasn't his wife. And she nodded. "Isn't she beautiful?" he asked. "Yes, she is," I answered, and my cousin nodded. Then we remembered that we had left the net in the river, so we went back to the willow tree and reached for the net. He was standing in the same place and looking at his phone. He then showed us very low-quality photos of men and other women in other suggestive poses, and those pictures really looked like pictures taken by a flip phone camera. "It's me," he said, and pointed to one of the men in the photo. We just nodded and said we should go home now. But then he said the words that frankly have haunted me for days. "Do you think my wife is beautiful? She also thinks you are handsome. She will be glad to meet you. Come with me to meet her and we can play together." "No, we have to go home," I answered. "You're a little party girl. Maybe your friend doesn't want to go home. Come on, I want to play with you," he said, and turned to my cousin. "No, I really want to go home," answered my cousin. Now this is where the memory details stop for me. The next thing I remember was him giving up. He just wasn't there anymore, and we were leaving giggling and laughing as we left and making fun of his voice and his tone on the way home. But I found it strange that only after so many years, I remembered this situation and dismissed it as a potential dream or false memory. But as his words continued to echo in my head, I called my cousin and described my memory, word for word as I described it here, and she said that it really happened, just a little different from how I remember it. She explained that all the details were correct, but as soon as she told him that she really wanted to go home, he was too close and we were too scared to run or turn our backs because we thought he would catch us. So we stayed there for a while and continued to pretend he wasn't there. We played with our catch, a fish in a bucket filled with water, and talked about our parents who work in the police. Obviously that was a lie. Her father is a forester and mine works in IT, and how they are so strong and can kill a person with one blow. The man did not believe our exaggerated story, and apparently continued to walk around us. Not very close, but he was watching us the whole time. So we waited and waited and waited, and at some point he went into the bushes behind us to pee. That's when we got up and started running. We ran across the bridge and kept running until we reached the part of the neighborhood where there are many houses. When we were already close to my house, I stopped in the middle of the road and said that my legs were not moving. So she helped me down to the curb and we sat there until I felt better. Then apparently they started joking. Today I know that what I experienced was a shock. As soon as I felt better, we returned home, threw the fish away, and after that decided to never go fishing again. We never told our parents because we knew that what happened was related to inappropriate material, and at the time we thought that anything related to this topic was shameful and should not be talked about. However, she said she was surprised that I thought it was a dream and that I didn't remember it until now. Because I had such an extreme reaction, and she has PTSD from the event. Even today, she does not go anywhere alone and is horrified when someone mentions the same yellow bridge. So, my meeting took place in February 2007. I used to work third shift in a paper factory warehouse. The main shift supervisor was on vacation, so our night shift supervisor decided she wanted to leave early. She let us get away about 2 hours before the usual shift end time, so it would have been between 4:30 and 5 a.m. I was now following a colleague on this county road as the warehouse was on the outskirts of my small rural town. I noticed that he hit the brakes and went off the road. I keep up with him and think to myself, what the hell is this dude doing? And then I saw it. A tall, dark figure strolled down the middle of the road, hunched over and swaying from side to side. I compared it to how one of those tall wind figures you see swaying in a car dealership or something moved. Very unnatural movements. It's hard to do it justice by describing it, as it would only make sense if someone saw it for themselves. It looked like a tall man wrapped in a large dark blanket or cloak or something. I had to hit the brakes and swerve as well, but I came to a complete stop. Whatever it was, I couldn't make out any signs or characteristics. I saw a large body with 2 legs. The top half was sort of hunched forward like she was leaning like an elderly person with a walker. I was driving a 1998 Ford Explorer at the time and looked at the height of the vehicle. He's about 6-7 inches, but everything that passed my driver's window was a good foot or more taller than that, also leaning forward. So I believe that whatever it was at least 7 feet tall. Again, I didn't really see a head or hands, just a figure with legs walking. My taillights illuminated him, however, as I began to pass him. I could not make out any precise details of the body. I didn't see any fur, leather, or anything similar to clothing. It was also solid, not like the translucent stuff. It was just big, fat, and black, or at least dark gray in color. My colleague pulled into a parking lot a little further down the road. I follow him, and it was obvious that he was scared. He said something like, "What was that?" He didn't have a head, among other things, which most alarmists talk about. We decided to go back and look at the man to see if he was still there and what he really was. I was driving in front, and he was behind. We drove up to the common area and noticed a large black animal on the road. It appeared to be a large black dog. Part of me knew it wasn't big enough to be the one walking down the road, but we had to stop because it was right in the middle of the road. I decided to get out and approach him while my coworkers kept yelling at me to get back in the car. However, when I realized that I was lying on the road, he raised his head and looked at me. His eyes glow yellow and I can see the glare of the headlights, but he's also growling at me. So I stop like a dummy and just stare at him. The creature then stands up on its hind legs like a human, but falls backwards. He sits down and kind of falls over on the side of the road like a wounded animal that can't use its front legs. In a minute, without thinking, I get into the car and drive off. What it was, we never understood.